When you're ready.
I'm recording,
Okay, great.
and I'm gonna say hi to everybody. My name is Karen Ellsworth, and I'm a member of the Board of Trustees of the Peacedale Museum of Art and Culture. And we're happy to welcome you to our 2022 Spring Lecture Series. And I'm going to turn this over to our President, Lisa Fiore, for an introduction of our speaker tonight. And before I go, I just want to remind you to keep yourselves muted and turn off your video because it will save bandwidth and it will help us broadcast better. And afterwards, when we're having questions and answers, you can unmute and go back on video. Take it away, Lisa.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Peacedale Museum of Art and Culture's Spring Lecture Series. I'm Lisa Fiore, President of the Board of Trustees. We are South County's oldest museum, and this year we're celebrating our 130th anniversary. We're delighted to say our doors are open and our collection is preserved and available to our community and beyond. Our main mission is to educate and influence young people in history and cultural diversity, so they in turn will become well-informed individuals as they navigate our ever-changing world. That is where our Vice President, Mary Brown, has been invaluable as our education coordinator, along with fellow trustee Louise Weaver. Karen Ellsworth is our incredible newsletter editor and Zoom technology whiz, along with our new trustee, Madonna Grady. Fellow trustees include Linda Hennessy as our super secretary, Elizabeth Cook as treasurer, and we wouldn't be here if we didn't have the dedication, knowledge, and steady guidance of Sarah Turnbaugh, Peggy Leeson, and Tim Philbrick. Thank you to all our wonderful trustees and our office manager, Julie Wardwell. Tonight, we welcome Dr. Kevin McBride, Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Connecticut and former Director of Research at the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center. One of his many research areas of interest is in battlefield archaeology. Tonight, we'll travel back roughly 350 years to North Smithfield in 1676 during King Philip's War and visit the site of the Second Battle of Nipsachuck. Many of us are familiar with and have visited the Great Swamp Fight site in West Kingston, fought in December of 1675. I'm not so sure how many of us are familiar with the Battle of Nipsachuck. We welcome Dr. Kevin McBride with interest as he shares the results of his archaeological research at this battle with us. Take it away, Kevin.
Thank you. I really appreciate the invitation. I just want to say hello to Tim and Bill. You guys, good to see you here. So my goal is to tell you about the Second Battle of Nipsachuck, which took place in North Smithfield in July 2nd, 3rd, 1676. But we've also had previously investigated or later investigated a Battle of Great Falls, which was we now consider one of the most significant battles of the King Philip's War because it directly led to the dissolution of the Native coalition fighting the English. But it also has a direct relationship to the Second Battle of Nipsachuck because Queapan, the Sunquehaw sachem of Narragansett, who the English attacked at Nipsachuck, had previously been at Turner's Falls. And in some respects, if Turner's Falls didn't happen, Nipsachuck may not have happened because Queapan was attempting to reach her homeland, but more importantly, attempting to reach out for engage in discussions of peace with Mass Bay and Connecticut, but that was purposely stopped. So we'll talk about both battles. I'll also give you an introduction to battlefield archaeology generally, and here, you can see where these two battles were. And I think we all know a lot about King Philip's War, the most destructive history proportional to the population and infrastructure. But I want you to read carefully James the printer's quote that he wrote. He wrote this on paper and nailed it to a post on a bridge after the Battle of Medfield. And that really resonates because it really conveys so many things about Native frustration and to a large extent, their strategy during the war. You know, you must consider the Indians lose nothing but their life. You must lose your fair houses and cattle. And that ultimately was the Native strategy during the war. Here's, you know, just a little information, get a sense of the, you know, the events that are leading to the war. A lot of it was, you know, increasing European expansion, settlement, etc. You can also see the number of towns that were attacked during the war. Now, when we approach these battlefield projects, we don't just want to document the stuff on the battlefield. Conflict, as I think many of you know, is a real window into society, cultural values, mores, social structure, political structure, complexity. It's just so many aspects that one can address, and it really the war in general has really helped us understand a lot more. Investigating these battles really helped us understand a lot more about King Philip's War, and we've really focused on trying as best as we can, which is, you know, is near impossible, to get a Native perspective on the war. But you know, what were they experiencing? What were they thinking about? What were they doing? And in fact, we do have some Native voices that come through in various ways, which we'll talk about. So these are the issues that we have actively pursued, we've written about, we've published about. And, you know, once we began to move beyond just simple battlefield documentation, we began to realize some things. And, you know, one of the things that really affected, and I think was ultimately contributed to the defeat of the Native coalition, was illness, sickness, malnutrition. I know, you know, we're aware of the, you know, the malnutrition aspects because the English kept, you know, people moving and targeted their stored food supplies. But one thing we've really not considered is the, you know, the disease, sickness, illness aspect. And my colleague who's investigated a lot of this, Ashley Bissonnette, has really done some wonderful work. And if you want a perspective or a sense of what Native people were experiencing during the war, just read Mary Rowlandson's account. And in respect to disease, everybody had, you know, the bloody flux and other diseases. Everyone was sick, ill, even Philip. You know, and that is degrading. I mean, when your entire communities and your combatants are ill, often sick, it really begins to wear you down. And you can see the quote by Cotton Mather after the war had a huge impact on Native people. And, you know, they're transmitting these sicknesses and illnesses because of their practices. You know, the English, who ultimately are the host for a lot of these diseases that often emanate out of Boston, you know, they're going to and from the field all the time. They're going to the field, they're coming back home, they're going to the communities, they're going back out, they're interacting with Native people in direct and indirect ways. Native people are, you know, taking European clothing, they're torturing them, they're, you know, they're in touch with, you know, bodily fluids. And it's not just Native people who experience these disease, illness, and sicknesses. The European, it was rampant throughout the European community as well at various times. So one thing we wanted to look at too is just what's the Native strategy in all this? I mean, this wasn't just a spontaneous uprising. You know, I hate to use that word uprising because that suggests it dominated people. But it's pretty clear this war had been planned for a decade before. Native communities were preparing. They didn't really see they had any other option. They knew their ways of life were going to be eliminated in a short period of time. But they're also very smart about, you know, strategy. And I think that's something we've never really realized before is the war, and we've debated Philip's role in it, and was he really in charge of things, et cetera, et cetera. And I would have to say, based on our research, yes. Maybe not complete, but he was instrumental. He had his role. He wasn't on the battlefield, but he was responsible for diplomatic initiatives, holding the coalition together, going after supplies, ammunition to the French, the Dutch, et cetera, et cetera. He played a significant role. And I think we minimize his role because we just don't see him on the battlefield. And that was not his role. Some really interesting patterns we've seen in terms of psychological warfare. You know, one example would be Native, you know, some of the combatants cutting off one leg of it, sending it back to the English community. And many, many examples like that. The fact that, you know, Native combatants always stripped English of their clothes and made them lay face down. Ultimate humiliation. You are taking away everything that makes them English, and the ultimate humiliation for a Native person was to be stripped naked. They're sending messages in all this, and you know the killing of livestock, although many of them they ate as well. So it's, you know, there's some patterns to all of this. A broader strategy, I think, as we just discussed, is destroying the English livelihood and infrastructure. Destroy everything it meant to be English. And that's in part references what I just talked about, stripping clothes and, you know, burning infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the most important aspects of this war, and I think we failed to realize this, is Native efforts, coalition efforts, initially just the Connecticut Valley, Native people, but later on, you know, the entire coalition, is to gain control of the upper Connecticut Valley. This was the breadbasket of New England. Whoever controlled the upper Connecticut Valley, and it was productive. It's amazing the amount of corn that's being produced and sent around. And this is largely why the Battle of Great Falls took place, is control of the valley. And when the Native coalition was defeated, well, they weren't defeated in that battle, but you know, there's circumstances as well that, you know, they realized they couldn't control the valley, because right after the Battle of Turner's Falls or Great Falls, Connecticut mass base sent, you know, hundreds of soldiers into the valley to control it. So one thing we did, we went through all the primary sources. We went through and identified, we have a database of every action that took place during King Philip's War, no matter how small, no matter how large. And we began to get a sense of how we might organize an analysis based on region. And these categories are based in part upon the tribes that are there, as well as the colonies that are involved. So, you know, Eastern is mostly Plymouth Colony. Central is Mass Bay, but in the East, we have mostly Wampanoag, various bands of Wampanoag. Central, Nipmuc, Quabog, and many others. Western is the upper Connecticut Valley, Pecumtuck, Agawam, Nortuck. Southern is Narragansett for the most part. In Connecticut, largely immune. There were things that took place, but Connecticut, unlike Mass Bay and Plymouth, quickly embraced and sought to bring in the native peoples of Connecticut as allies and friends. And they were largely responsible. They were largely responsible for the ultimate defeat of a lot of the native coalition, because native Mohegan, Pequot, and Western, Tunxus and Western Niantic have played a significant role in that. This is a graphic we created from that data, just to give you kind of a sense of what the nature of the actions were. Clearly, the attacks are dominated by the native coalition, which, by the way, was comprised of every single native band, group, tribe outside of Connecticut for the most part, throughout New England. And one thing we're not talking about is the Northern Theater, which the war there continued for another year. And this is just an analysis of coalition of attacks and named summons. And when we began to look at this, we did see patterns. These are not random attacks. The coalition, particularly after the Narragansett entered the war, were in constant discussions. And we know it's a unified effort. And one way we realize it's a unified effort is when you look at the composition of the native combatants and various attacks, it's always multi-tribal, always. How do we know that? Well, if you look at the testimonies of the court martials of various native men, combatants who were captured and after the attack on Providence, it's amazing how many groups they represent, how many battles they fought in. This wasn't a local tribal thing where the Quabog are just attacking the settlements in their area. In any given attack, there are at least a half dozen groups represented. And the other thing that was interesting that we found is the command and control. The attack on Providence, one would think that would be led by a Narragansett. No, it was led by Pecumtuck. And we see that over and over again. Native, there's various organizational, military organizational patterns that we've seen, and one of them is the sachems, of course, but then people leading these attacks are captains of significant rank, varying rank, and they're commanding hundreds of men, and it varies. The fact that there is multiple combatants who comprise several tribes, and the organizer of the attack, the leader, is often from different tribes in that territory, also gives you a sense of a real coalition organization. One thing I just wanted to point out is in the early part of the war, a lot of the effort was the attacks. Well, obviously they were in the Eastern Theater, Plymouth, but then they shifted to the Connecticut native attacks. And that's part of this larger strategy. And it waned for a bit. And with the Narragansett entry, some of the focus was shifted a bit to central. But if you look in the right-hand side of that graph, we begin to see more effort expended into the Eastern, into the Western Theater, Connecticut Valley. And Connecticut always responded in kind. I use Connecticut because they were mostly responsible for the efforts to bring the war to the native people in Connecticut Valley. Mass Bay was involved elsewhere. It was Connecticut also that was responsible for the attack at Nipsachuck. And you can see they're basically mirroring, responding to native attacks. So that worked to the native advantage sometimes. So, you know, one of the large Native efforts, as I mentioned, was to gain control of the Connecticut Valley, and they almost succeeded. Northfield, Squawkey was abandoned, Deerfield was abandoned. There were discussion in Connecticut and Mass Bay whether to abandon the other settlements, Hatfield, Hatley, Northampton, consolidated Springfield. The Native strategy was working. Connecticut was vehemently opposed to that. But it did almost succeed. And one of the things the coalition did, and this is one of the few times Connecticut was attacked in small raids, nothing major. There was a number of forays into Connecticut, again, by a number of, by combatants who represent a number of different tribes, to draw the Connecticut army out of the Connecticut Valley, and it worked. And this is why, Native people were able to take advantage of that gap, if you will, in protection to, gather at Turner's Falls, Great Falls, and begin in the spring. So the other thing I just want to acknowledge is all of the projects we've done were funded by the National Park Service American Battlefield Protection Program. This is what they do. Their goal and objective is to protect and preserve and document American battlefields important in American history. When I say we, Nipsachuck-Dr Museum and the University of Connecticut, we were really the first people in the country to do 17th century battlefields. And battlefield archaeology is somewhat, I don't know if it's specialized. Anybody can do it. I do it. So, but it's a growing field, and it really began in the mid '80s when Doug Scott, a park ranger at the Battle of Little Bighorn National Park Service station, they investigated the battle and developed techniques and methods to document the battle and sort of reconstruct the battle. And we've borrowed many of their techniques. The big difference between what their methodology and ours is, the Battle of Bighorn was a post-Civil War battle, so we have rifled firearms. They were able to document individual firearms and bullets and casings as they moved across the battlefield. That's pretty good stuff. We're dealing with musket balls, but we've adapted, and I think we've had some decent success. So this is our, the projects we have done.
I've got everybody else muted.
And each one contributes to our learning curve, and there's always a learning curve. So we've done, 4 Pequot War battlefields. We've done a couple of Kingfield 4 battlefields. We've done a couple of War of 1812 battlefields. We're doing a Rev War battlefield now, but each battle, while different, helps that learning curve, which is always steep. And these are our basic tools. Without a metal detector, we're lost in the water, and without people to operate it, when we started these projects, we thought any idiot could operate a metal detector. No, we have a core group of I hesitate to call them hobbyists, because they're not. They are professionals. They are students of the technology. Without these guys, we would not know anything. We call them the Jedi Masters, and they are truly fantastic. The other thing we do focus on is employing military training analysis, so the acronym COCA, which actually the Park Service requires. Sort of trying to visualize the battlefield landscape as a combatant who is there would. And how does that help us understand the ebb and flow of the battle? We spent thousands of hours gleaning through primary sources to get all kinds of information. And there are a lot of one of the more interesting things about King Philip's War compared to the Pequot War that we've done is the sources in King Philip's War are extensive in comparison. And we can draw upon Hubbard and Mather and many others who either were firsthand observers of a battle or talked to someone who participated in the battle. And it's complex, but the goal is to sort of synthesize these down into a sort of a coherent sequence. So the goal is for us is not just to document the boundary of a battlefield based upon the distribution of battle-related objects. It's to add a temporal dimension, sequence that battle, movement. And it's a challenge with 7th century records and the nature of the battle-related objects, but we've done pretty well. We're able to look at the diameter and calibers of weapons, or we look at direction of fire sometimes from, if the musket ball is impacted on a hill or a rock. We can look at dropped and impacted musket balls. There's actually a lot that one can begin to infer. So the battle.
Kevin, can I interrupt you for a second? I'm sorry. Are those your dogs barking in the background?
Yeah, and I don't know how to stop them.
Yeah, I have a hard time controlling Zoom too, because I've got everybody else muted and I'm getting some complaints from people about the dogs.
All right,
barking.
well, you want to give me a second? I'll see if I can.
Yeah,
just
sure.
go outside.
Thank
Okay.
you. Sure.
All right, give me a minute. Okay, I guess it's the one disadvantage of doing this from home.
Thank you.
No control.
Poor dogs.
But in my defense, there's 5 of them, so they made quite a racket. So, all right, so we're going to talk first about the Battle of Great Falls, and here's the sort of the breakdown. This, in our opinion, this is probably the most significant battle of King Philip's War, because it, even though it's technically, half of the battle was an English victory, half of the battle was a native victory, but ultimately it led to the dissolution of the coalition of native people and the end of the war. And that's why we consider it very significant. But the gist is that the settlers in Hatfield, Upper Connecticut Valley, Hatfield, Northfield, Northampton, et cetera, were concerned about the native people who were gathering at the Great Falls. At this point in the war, this is, native people they're starving, they've been pursued, they're in ill health. They're gathering at Great Falls to replenish food supplies. Anadromous fish is one reason, and also to regain control of the Connecticut Valley. So the English know this. And when I say the English, this is the English of the upriver settlements, and they're trying to enlist Connecticut and Mass Bay to assist them, and they're not that anxious to, because they're pursuing peace talks. But the local militias and colonists, take it upon themselves to attack this village at Great Falls. And what they know about the village is from an English soldier who was captured and escaped. So they only know about one village. What they don't know is there were 5 others. So this is not a well-planned expedition. This complex map, what I want you to bring your attention to is the route of retreat, but that's also the route of approach to the village at Peskiamska that was attacked. And the initial attack was surprise. They were, they killed over 300 native people, but because they didn't gather sufficient intelligence, they didn't know that there were 6 other villages nearby, and each of those villages coordinated their attacks to intercept and attack the English throughout the entire 6.5-mile retreat, which led to a pretty devastating impact on the English. One of the key aspects of the terrain was the river fords, Green River, Deerfield River, and others, and the swamps and wetlands. So the native people obviously knew this terrain extremely well. They knew exactly where the English were going to retreat to, and they were able to set up ambushes along the entire way. And as I said, with devastating attacks. So the one common denominator we have in all these battlefields are musket balls. And, it's a challenge to tell a lot from a musket ball, but you can sometimes. You can tell if they dropped or impacted. If they impact against the hillside or boulder, you can tell what direction of fire there was. We've also began to understand that, native combatants preferred certain caliber weapons, lighter weapons, 50 caliber, post 60s, where the English were sort of all over the place. We also began to understand certain tactics. The large majority, the largest percentage of musket balls on actually any of these battlefields, Pequot War and so forth, were in the 30s to 40s. And they have these facets. And what that means is they're being loaded as buckshot. So both native and Europeans are loading the weapons in the same way, and that's because they can't fire, they can't aim for very well, but it also means they have to get close enough to their enemy to have any effect. So we often see this pattern when English are attacking a native village, because they usually, it's a surprise attack, they're getting it pretty close, but the native combatants are using this as well. We also pick up all kinds of stuff on the battlefield that's, battle related to, weapons of various kinds, sear springs, cock arms, exploded, barrels, and other clues. This is pretty esoteric, but this musket ball on the left, it has what we call a firing hemisphere that only occurs when that diameter musket ball fits pretty closely to the caliber of the weapon. So is that important? Yes, because that tells us, what caliber is being chosen. And as I said, from various lines of evidence, we have a pretty good sense of what the preference for native calibers were. We also find, because this is there were horses involved in this attack, we find a lot of horse tack. There's a couple of really interesting concentrations of horse tack and musket balls of low diameter, suggesting native. That indicates that native people caught some soldiers that were on horseback in a particular area. We also get personal items, a lot of amulets, what we call amulets, but we also got brass scrap and other things. We see pewter buttons, although that could be English or native, depending. Here's the brass scrap. It's a pretty good signature for most 17th century native domestic sites. And this is something that's pretty interesting. we discovered in our research, this is a club, I think it's Maple, that was picked up off the the Great Falls battlefield by a soldier who was there and it stayed in the family for hundreds of years. It's now in the Thaw collection at the museum in Cooperstown, but it's remarkable, absolutely remarkable object, and it has really good convenience. Here's the entire distribution of musket balls, and I just say this so we can sort of look at the battle a bit. Now, these gaps, they largely reflect areas where we just couldn't get permissions to sample. And to some extent too, these gaps represent that, plus this is an area right over the Greenfield Ford where the English were probably finally able to, open up their horses and, outpace their native pursuers. And that's why we find such fewer musket balls there. And just to give you a couple of examples of how we reconstruct an event or parts of the battle. Here's a village, the English attack, they're, looting, they're killing, and they get word that Philip's coming with 1,000 men and they panic. These guys are just local boys. They've had no combat experience. They just absolutely panic. And they rush back to get their horses, which are here. And the gap is an interesting battle because it suggests it indicates what we had been finding, what we have later found along the entire route of retreat. The native combatants, with their leadership, command and control, knew where the English were going to be, and they would send groups of natives in front of the English and constantly ambush them. We saw this time and again. And here's an example of a flanking movement. One group of natives is pursuing the English through this gap, and one group flanks them and just pour fire into them as they're going through this gap. There must have been 150 musket balls that we saw there. And as they cross, here's the gap over to your right. As they cross the Fall River, they get their horses, they want to get out of there. And the only way out are these swales. And we see a high concentration of musket balls in these swales. You can see the swale here, and concentration of musket balls there. So the native combatants knew exactly how to predict where the English were going to be. And this is why they exacted such a heavy toll. There was a 45% casualty rate on the English. I think 39 killed, 29 wounded. But, the aftermath of that battle was profound and significant. One thing that resulted is Mass ended all peace negotiations and decided to prosecute the war to the utmost. Connecticut ordered Major Talcott, who was the commander of the attack on Nipsachuck, to go out against the enemy, destroy them at Squaw Creek, Deerfield. And that was their primary focus of Connecticut at that shortly after the battle, was the upper Connecticut River Valley. But more importantly, the native coalition really began to dissolve after this battle for complex reasons I don't think we quite understand. There were certainly disagreements about the future course of the war, peace or fighting. Philip, for example, was vehemently against peace overtures and ransoming any English, although he made an exception for Mary Rowlandson. Mohawk raids, who the English managed to convince to help them, was a major factor. I think one of the reasons too is their vision for control of the valley and its potential corn supplies was gone. It was lost. They're also war weary, sickness, illness, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the more interesting things that I always found was the Wampanoag and Narragansett began to make their way home. And they must have known that they were facing certain death. for the most part, especially Philip. But they wanted to go home. They went home. The middle Connecticut, the upper Connecticut Valley tribes fled, most of them fled west or north. West to the Mohican, who they'd always maintained some connections with, and some eventually made their way out to the Miami in the Connecticut, in the Ohio Valley. So this brings us to the Second Battle of Nipsachuck. So this map on the left is a bit of a prelude to the battle too. So I mentioned Talcott, I mentioned the Connecticut efforts to, clean out the Connecticut Valley in some respects. So in mid-June, Connecticut was planning an expedition of 300 dragoons and 100 Mohegan Pequot to Waupaquasset on the way to the Connecticut Valley. Waupaquasset was an area of concern because of enemy there. But for reasons that we don't understand, Talcott had specific orders to go north to Waupaquasset in the Connecticut Valley. But at the last minute, he veers toward Nipsachuck. Why? Well, I think he got intelligence that Queapan, the Narragansett Sunksqua sachem, with her community, was making her way, was there. And by that point in the war, she was one of the few native Narragansett leaders left who could, gather and galvanize continued, continue the fight, so to speak. That and the fact that Connecticut was totally freaked out by her, decades of her, interactions with the English, and you could just see, it's just really interesting to see their reaction to her. She was very powerful, very influential, and they were aware of her, her potential for continuing the war. Although that wasn't her purpose. Her purpose was to seek peace. And it's probably why she was, I have to say she might have been probably executed. But we needed to find the location of the Second Battle of Nipsachuck. And this is always the problem with 7th century battlefields. You really don't know where they are. At some point, after our, third grant or so of the National Park Service, I admitted to them, I said, you give us these grants, but we really don't know where the battlefield is. And they go, we know. We just trust you to find it and figure it out. And, Paul Robinson was instrumental in helping us figure this out. There were just, these are the clues we had. One of the most important clues, though, was Spruce Swamp. And we spent a lot of time, looking at English records, documents, how specific were they about pine swamp, spruce swamp, very specific. And the second half, the southern half of this swamp was spruce, the only spruce swamp in the region. So that really helped us to sort of, potentially, locate the battlefield. We also did some, view sheds, using GIS applications to see how, it fit with, our expectations about where it was. We identified, key terrain features. This, although not depicted, this elevated terrain feature here and there is actually what separated the pine swamp to the north and the spruce swamp to the south. And that was enormously helpful. Cat Hill was an important feature too. The English are encamped somewhere west of there, northwest, west, southwest. And their battle plan was to divide their 300 dragoons, half to the north, half to the south, Mohegan Pequot at the summit, and at the signal, conduct a coordinated attack and envelopment of this community of 150 or so people. It worked. It was brilliant, highly coordinated. And, you know, it tells you something about the fact that, you know, the experience of the Connecticut militia, the dragoons at this point, and Mohegan Pequot, and their relationship. These men had been fighting together for a year. They trusted one another. They understood one another. And it led to a pretty sophisticated and you know, devastating attack. So these are the kinds of things we're looking for that would indicate, you know, in the presence. We want to know where the Narragansett village was. And one of the reasons we had so much trouble finding it is we thought it would be a concentrated village. Well, it wasn't. It was like 6 different locations, and the signatures were low because, as the English mentioned, they had just arrived there. There wasn't that much debris to be found, dropped, processed, whatever. So it took us a while to figure that. That's part of that learning curve. But these are the things we found that would, you know, clearly identified, you know, a native presence. The other things we're looking for are horseshoes. You know, I used to own a lot of horses, and I know what happens when you run them around. You throw shoes, you throw nails, and I figured there would be a good signature, and we did find it. You know, here's a hand wrought horseshoe nail. That was pretty interesting. We actually could trace the English movements from the horseshoe nails. And then pewter buttons, although technically they could be used by associated with native or English. This is an interesting object. It's a flint wrap. So you don't just put a flint, and by this time there's no matchlocks except in garrisons, perhaps. These guys are all using carbines or you know, or flintlocks, certainly. But native people, and we learned this from Pequot, the Nipsachuck-Pequot Monumentic Fort, which was occupied and used during the King Philip's War. They make bifacial gun flints. They don't make spalls. They don't make blades. They're bifacial gun flints. They have a very distinct form to them. And this, in order to properly seat a gun flint in the jaws of a flintlock, you need either, you know, hide or lead to seat it properly so it won't sort of jiggle around when you fire it. So this is a gun flint, and I know you can't really see these, but these are jaw marks. And it fits perfectly there would be another half of this. Fits perfectly a bifacial gun flint. So whether it be Narragansett, Pequot, Mohegan, we don't know, but we're pretty sure that native people are all making these kinds of gun flints. So here is the distribution of musket balls by, you know, diameter and dropped or impacted. This will make more sense once we sort of reconstruct the battle. But the heaviest fighting, where the heaviest presence of musket balls is, correlates with where these 6 native communities were. So here's the musket balls. You know, there's large diameter, but as I said, most of them are small diameter. Here's a graphic that reflects that. And that's typical of all of the 17th century battlefields we've seen. That's the preferred tactic, is to load your weapon with multiple loads of small shot and get close enough to, you know, do some damage. So here's the, you know, here's the timeline. Just, you know, look at this carefully. So we didn't have a lot to go on. And this is a testament, I think, to our learning curve. I was proud of our guys to sort of figure this out with such little information, but we were able to figure out the sequence of what I just, had described earlier. The dragoons, split into two groups, surround the hill. The Mohegan Pequots are coming down. Complete surprise. The Narragansett had no idea. Is from what we can understand, there was only 30 Narragansett combatants, men who were defending, and it's typical of Native men during King Philip's War. They always suffered enormous losses to buy enough time for the rest of the community to get away. I think that's one thing we also haven't recognized is, a lot of the combatant losses among Native people in King Philip's War were those kinds of tactics. They were, they were clearly superior to the English, unless they had Mohegans and Pequots with them on the battlefield. Without that. So here's everything, and you can see the Native communities, I guess 4, maybe 5. And so this is how we interpret the battlefield to unfold. There's a northern wing of the English and a southern wing. And this is all based upon direction of fire, drop musket balls, various patterns. We feel fairly confident based upon the historical record and the distribution of battle-related objects. This is what happened. I'm sure it was much more complex than this, but the English clearly enveloped this community really quickly. I don't know how long the battle lasted. Probably no more than half an hour, I would have to say. Now, so one thing we do always is we want to know as much about the combatants as we can, Native or English, their experience, their tactics, previous battles, whatever we can find out about them. So George Dennison was of interest to us. He was a pretty prominent figure throughout King Philip's War, second in command to Talcott in this battle. And in our research, we found what we knew he was a Pequot War veteran, but he went back to England to fight in the Civil War with Cromwell in the 40s. And he rose to captain of cavalry. And at that time, Cromwell was revolutionizing cavalry tactics, training, weapons, tactics, everything. So George Dennison was a recipient of all this. And this is his signature on this battle. I mean, this was one of the most complex battles of the King Philip's War. It was the only horse-mounted attack of the entire war. And to coordinate 300 dragoons and 2 wings and 100 Mohegan Pequot to attack an envelopment and a signal testifies, one, as I mentioned before, these guys knew each other. They had fought together for a year. They trusted each other. But also just, the command and control that the English exerted. Granted, there were only 30 Narragansett defenders, but it was still a pretty interesting, tactic that took place. So one of the things we also discovered during this is the Connecticut War Council, who directed most of the war efforts, all of the war efforts, was primarily focused on larger territories, the central area, the Connecticut Valley. They rarely talk about Narragansett country. Yet, for once, shortly after the Great Swamp Fight, from January through August, Connecticut had a major presence in Narragansett country. They were sending 60 to 80 dragoons and 30 to 40 Mohegan Pequot every other week into Narragansett country to kill, capture, drive away Narragansett men and women, including Rhode Island colonists, I have to add. And they recovered and destroyed hundreds, if not thousands, of bushels of stored corn. You don't see this in Connecticut records. Where you see it is in Thomas Miner's diary. He was lieutenant of dragoons in charge of all this. And if you look at his diary and sort of pull out from it all his references to Narragansett country and going in these expeditions, it's a pretty clear indication. So what was this all about? Well, it's about the competing claims to Narragansett country by Rhode Island and Connecticut. Before the King Philip's War, there was intense legal, actions between the two colonies. In fact, in Westerly, at some point, there were shots fired. Connecticut claimed Narragansett country, Rhode Island claimed Narragansett country. So what we now realize what was going on is the reason Connecticut was expending so much effort into Narragansett country. And by the way, these dragoons, they're all from London County. They never went on any other expeditions. Their entire focus during the war was Narragansett country after the Great Swamp Fight. And what is a clear indication of this is, well, let me just back up a little bit. So Queepan, she's making her way into Narragansett country and ultimately to Mass Bay with a letter suing for peace, trying to negotiate a peace. That is not in Connecticut's interest. Absolutely not in Connecticut's interest. She was the last of the Narragansett sachems. She literally needed to be eliminated in her people. And this is in part what that attack was all about. The fact that Talcott changed his plans, literally at the last minute, the last 24 hours, veered toward Narragansett country. I contend it's likely because he had intelligence that she was there. And she was no ordinary person. She was problematic to the Connecticut English on a number of levels. And this is what we see at the war's end. When the war ends, August 22nd, Connecticut publishes this letter in Hartford, Providence, and New London. They're basically claiming Narragansett country, Rhode Island settlements, based on vacuum domicilium. They emptied the space with their constant attacks and claimed it by right of conquest. I think that's pretty interesting. It's sort of a subtext to a lot of Connecticut's efforts, certainly in Rhode Island. So with that, I'll leave it there and be glad to answer any questions you might have.
Well, you can unmute yourselves, anyone who would like to ask Kevin a question. And it would help if you use the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand if you have a question. Peter Fay has a question.
Yeah, that was really fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And the reason is because I've been just doing a lot of reading on King Philip War. But I had a question. I just, a couple of weeks ago, I read an article about Wissahickon, which as I assume is, north of Turner's Falls. That's where the battle apparently happened. But there seems to be only, my understanding is the name for that area is only comes from one one source, John Pynchon, and he only mentioned it one time. And everyone's always wondered where the heck it is. And I read a paper saying that it almost certainly was not Furnace Falls, even though it's been called that, the battle of that area, but it was instead much farther out west. And so I'm just curious. I'm sure you know that debate, and I'm curious what you think about it. And the other, I'll stick in another question. Do you believe that the Mohawks' intervention to me made with the major difference in the war, the cutting off of the gunpowder, et cetera, to the native tribes? Or do you really think it was really just kind of a collapse in the western side of the state, that some kind of internal collapse of their coalition that really did it?
That's a good question. That's a complex question. As far as the place name, I really can't weigh in much because I don't understand. And you're right, there's only one reference. I think Peter Thomas and Marge Bruchac wrote an article on this that, they're good scholars. Whatever they say, I would have to, trust. I can't recall exactly, but that's the name, the coalition, the new coalition of native tribes who formed part of the Battlefield Advisory Group, which was probably the best part of this project. We're working with a wide range of descendants of the battle, English and native. But that's the place names they choose to accept, and that's what we do. As far as the Mohawk, it's a tough question because, if you search through the records of Mohawk incursions at the Connecticut Valley, we only know about the ones the English knew about. And it's pretty clear to me that it was much more extensive. Just as an example, when the English attacked the village at Peskianska at Great Falls, they reported that initially the native people there thought it was a Mohawk attack that they had been experiencing. And shortly after that battle, and this is weak evidence, admittedly, but shortly after the battle at Great Falls, there was a Mohawk raid, one or two. I think it played a role. I'm not sure it was a deciding factor, but these tribes were already greatly weakened. I still have a hard time understanding why they didn't continue. I mean, they lost several hundred people during the attack, but at that time there was at least 12 native villages up that way. Abnaki, Narragansett, Wampanoag, Nortuck, Kumtuk, list goes on. And something happened. I mean, they technically lost 300 people. They won the battle. They had the upper hand. But I think that Connecticut and Mass Bay were going to refocus, and they knew it. They were going to refocus their efforts on reclaiming the valley. That valley was the most important landscape in King Philip's War. That's where all the food was coming from. And it's pretty clear. The English knew it, Native people knew it, and that was the Native strategy. That was the English strategy.
Anybody else have a question? Questions? Anybody else? I have a question, Kevin. What percentage of the artifacts that you found in North Smithfield were 17th century, and how many were later?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I think you would all, recognize that, so there's 350 to 75 years of land use after these battles. These battlefields are loaded with all kinds of stuff that reflect those land use patterns, and a lot of modern stuff sometimes too. It can be really, really challenging. So we encounter a lot of non-battle related objects that reflect that land use. I mean, probably 10 to 1. Maybe not quite 10 to 1, but a lot. And of course, if you have to remove them because you need to metal detect over the same area several times. And if you remove them, you have to care for them because they're part of, town history, colonial history, whatever. So it's a challenge. We walk away with at least 3 times as many non-battle related as battle related objects, but we do toss all modern stuff. I mean, if there's one common denominator on every battlefield we've ever done, it's beer cans, pop tabs, and 22s. People love to drink and shoot shit. And it's, across the board. Those you can discard. But, we do value, there's no quicker way to understand the land use of a property than metal detecting it. Documents are fine, they'll suggest one thing, but I think we all know as archaeologists that they're not enough. So we have a lot of that stuff, and we usually turn them over to the local historical society once they're conserved.
Any other questions? Anybody have a question? Oh, come on. No questions? I'm maybe going to put you on the spot, but I want to know whether you have read the new book by Lisa Brooks.
Oh yeah, of course.
And
Yeah.
and what you thought of it.
Excellent. We've read a lot of King Philip's War literature, and the thing that I value most of all is different perspectives that people bring.
And hers is a completely different.
Yeah,
I don't know. I've never read anything from that perspective. I've never found anything.
And that's one thing we were really trying to elicit. And this sounds a little lame, is the white trained Western archaeologists, but we really were trying to see a native voice. And what was interesting is we did see it. There was a couple of accounts, one in particular by a guy named Jonathan Wells, who was a 16-year-old boy during the battle. And he wrote a narrative of the battle in his 60s or 70s. And he went on to become, he fought in other wars as well. And his narrative was really important for us to understand certain aspects of the battle. But when you read it carefully, you see that there's information that he is providing that could only have been obtained from a native person who fought in the battle. There's no way he could have known this. So he is talking to, interacting with, maybe friends with, or at least respectful relationship with native combatants years after the battle who fought in the battle. And they're talking about it. That kind of blew us away. And it's pretty clear that's the only way he could have gotten this information. And it informs us a lot about the battle. And the other avenue, as I said, sadly, is from native combatants captured after the Battle of Providence attack, who were court-martialed in Newport, and they're being deposed. and they're asking them all kinds of questions, and they're very forthcoming. So those are the few times that comes out, but that's great and interesting. But to have a perspective from someone like Lisa is extremely important, because I mean, she comes at this from a very different knowledge base and cultural perspective that we could never hope to achieve. So those are really rare and important documents and perspectives.
Well, for those of you who are not familiar with that book, it's called Our Beloved Kin, and it's by Lisa Brooks, who I believe is a professor at Amherst. Am I correct?
Not
Professor at
Amherst. She's in the English department.
Okay.
One
And
of the five
she's
colleges. I'm
An
sorry.
Abenaki? What tribe is she? Is she?
Oh, I believe she's Wampanoag.
Okay. I recommend it. I haven't finished it yet, but I recommend it.
Oh, it's an excellent
Kevin
book.
recommends it too. So, any other questions from anybody?
I have a question.
Go,
Linda,
go, Linda.
Elena.
probably a stupid question, but where did the native peoples get all their guns?
That's not a stupid question. We obsessed about that question.
Oh,
So it looks like Native communities throughout Southern New England were preparing for this war for at least 10 years, probably longer. And this wasn't the first time. I mean, there's other Native leaders before that who were echoing the same concerns that Philip was about, encroachment and loss of life. So they were preparing. Some they probably got from the English, although the English were largely by law banned from selling or fixing native guns. Most of them were probably being obtained from the French or
oh,
Dutch over a long period of time.
okay.
And the reason we were obsessing about this is we wanted to know, because it would help us identify musket balls on the battlefield that might be associated with Native people. So we looked at all kinds, we looked at Peter Thomas's Fort Hill excavations. We looked at burial sites that yielded bullet molds, musket balls, any evidence at all that could be associated with Native people. And there was a distinct pattern of lower caliber weapons, which were lighter. I know this doesn't mean much, but in the 50 to 60 diameter range, which would be 55 to 63 caliber range. Very distinctive. There's a clear pattern. The other thing that's interesting, and this,
Are you saying that in that caliber, those were made by the French?
the lower you can't say exclusively. This is what I mean by a pattern. But French and Dutch weapons tended to be of lower caliber
Okay.
because they were lighter, and Native people preferred those. They're more maneuverable. They're shorter barreled, and we saw that pattern. Whenever we could get a firm association between the caliber of weapon in English or Native, the preponderance of evidence suggested Native people preferred these lower caliber, lighter weapons.
Okay. Thank you.
The French, primarily.
Any other questions?
I have one. Yeah, I have a question. I was interested that you mentioned the court martial in Newport, which was, when I've talked to people in Newport about the King Philip War and the kind of the end of it, the whole end of the whole process, which was the court martial, and the executions that happen in Newport, I get this blank stare, like no one seems to realize that the leaders of the Narragansett were executed there after the end of the war. There's no recognition, no monument to the people, to the leaders that were executed. Really no historical memory whatsoever. That is, the tours you get of the city don't mention it. Even the tours of early Newport don't mention it. And you mentioned how people reacted, how the leaders reacted when they're on trial. And I'm looking at it here. Quannapen, who was, I think, the last living leader, sachem of the war, said that he fought against the English nation. He was at the swamp fight, and he had nothing to say against the Indians burning and destroying Pettaquamscut, and that he was at the assault of Mr. William Carpenter's garrison at Pawtucket. He would, goes on and on about all the battles he was at, and basically regrets nothing. And I mean, this is an account of a warrior that fought in most of the major battles and was, executed because he obviously was, I guess the reasoning was he was taking up arms against the government, I guess. But I'm wondering, there's been so much commemoration of other areas, for example, the Turner's Falls, where you did that great archaeological dig, and the one up in North Smithfield. Are there any plans or any other commemorations of the different places of the war that might come about, or how do you see that whole thing? Are you just really just focused on battlefields and nothing else?
Well, I don't want to diminish those, but that's up to the community. And we have worked with a number of communities in the battlefields that we have documented. The goal of the Park Service is, we do these studies, and the hope is that the community will pick it up and begin to take the next step. That's not up for us. And there's been some remarkable efforts in that respect, Great Falls, certainly. Several Pequot War battles. And Saybrook and others. And I think that's been very rewarding from our perspective, but that's not our role. Our role is to do this and then encourage community involvement. And the Park Service does provide other grants, not just to document battlefields, but to provide grants for education, exhibit development, public outreach, preservation. So these communities that we've done these grants in, most of them have continued to pursue the opportunity. But, we never considered it to be our job. I mean, we'll definitely be there. We don't walk away. But, I think you're right. The Newport court-martials they're largely unknown. They're very compelling, profoundly disturbing, and informative all at the same time. I mean,
and they're native voices. One of the only native voices.
But you know what struck me about those voices? And I could be reading into this, but you know, if you look at the way that, you know, Puritan court martials or court proceedings occurred, it was really often just based upon one person's word against another. Or, you know, you didn't need a preponderance of evidence. These native guys, knowing they're going to be executed if they say the wrong thing, they never lied. Ever. And I always thought that was really interesting. Like, you know, you could have saved yourself. Just that wasn't there. You know? So I don't know if that means anything in the broader scheme of things, but it really was informative in terms of the heterogeneity of the participants in these attacks, the leadership. This was a true, you know, Philip may not have been directing every aspect of this war. I don't think he was, but he played an important role. But many people, many Native people stepped up with, you know, different leaders in different situations, you know, gathering tribal members, you know, Native peoples from different affiliations. This was truly a regional effort. And I think that's one thing that I never truly understood. That I think the coalition felt they were in this together. You know, this is all or none, all of us or none of us.
Except the Pequots and Mohegans.
Well, that's a complicated question. Keep in mind that most of the native peoples they were fighting against were their traditional enemies, number one. And, you know, they fared pretty well under the English since the Pequot War. So, but we, you know, we have indications that there were some serious discussions in these councils about what do we do? Do we do this? Do we do that? It's a complicated time. You're right.
Any other questions?
Linda?
I just have a funny story because I'm not a native of this area. And when I moved here many, many years ago, I heard about King Philip's War and I was like, oh my gosh, what's that all about? And my family and I went to the Newport Creamery in Wakefield to get something to eat. And along the whole wall were these pictures of Native Americans. And I thought, oh, I'm going to go take a, you know, I'm figuring King Philip, he had a crown, he was white, he was, you know, I didn't know. And all of a sudden I go off and I'm looking at all these pictures of these Indians and there's King Philip. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what? So that was a revelation for me.
That's cute. That's cute, Linda. Well,
It's very interesting and thank
yeah,
you very
Kevin,
much.
that was
Thank you.
fascinating. I will agree with Peter. Absolutely fascinating and just grateful to have you with us. And I'm sure your information will keep evolving. And we hope to have you back at some point. If,
Oh, I love to hear myself talk, so invite me anytime.
oh, good.
Well,
It's,
don't
yeah,
worry, we'll ask you again.
yeah, we just certainly will. So thank you so much. And Karen,
Thank
thanks
you for
again
inviting me.
That was great.
for being a Zoom person. Yeah, it really was fascinating. I mean, just the perspective is incredible. And then just for other people, if you haven't received our newsletter yet, you can certainly email us and we'll email it out to you or mail it. And we do have another program coming up on May 5th. And it's the 18th Century Travelers in Rhode Island by historian Robert A. Geek. And then we have back again Tim Cranston, who will lead a walking tour of the Elm Grove Cemetery in North Kingstown, Saturday, May 21st. So thank you all for joining us. And it really was fascinating. And we hope to see you again. So have a good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night, all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin.
Kevin, that
Thank
was
you.
great.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.